Hey everyone, and welcome back. We're kicking things off today with another deep dive, and this time it's all about fluency in English.
Ooh.
We're taking inspiration from an episode of The Simple Pod called How to Think in English, The Secret to Fluency.
I love that episode.
Yeah, and it really got us thinking about how we can, rewire our brains to make English feel more natural, not just memorizing grammar rules or vocab, but really thinking in English.
Yeah. What's so cool about that episode is how they talk about reducing that translation time. That mental lag we experience when we're constantly switching between languages.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's like our brain is hitting a speed bump every time we try to speak. So how do we tackle this? How do we get rid of that speed bump?
Well, the Simple Pod suggests we start thinking in English about those everyday things around us. Like right now, what do you see?
Let me see. Well, right now I see a microphone and a really comfy chair.
Nice.
Oh, and a window with sunlight streaming through it.
Yes.
It feels a little strange saying it out loud, but I can see how this could become a habit.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about forging these new pathways in your brain and making English your default.
That's a great way to put it. So by constantly describing things in English, we're essentially carving out a mental expressway for the language.
You got it.
Now, the Simple Pod takes this a step further and suggests talking to ourselves in English throughout the day. I have to admit, talking to myself in English feels a little out there, but I'm willing to try it.
I think it's a great idea. It's like giving your inner monologue an English makeover. Narrate your actions, your thoughts, even that mental grocery list.
So instead of thinking, I need to buy milk, I should be thinking, I need to pick up some milk from the store, all in English.
You got it.
Okay, I see. The Simple Pod also mentioned describing your day in English before you go to sleep. What's the thought behind that?
It's like turning your daily experiences into mini English lessons. You're actively processing your day in English.
Wow, I hadn't thought about it that way. So it's not just about practicing vocabulary, it's about improving overall fluency.
Yes.
Okay, now, another challenge that a lot of language learners face is constantly relying on translations. How do we break free from that?
The Simple Pod suggests a really interesting approach. Learning English through English.
Learning English through English? What does that even mean?
It's about breaking free from that crutch of your native language. Instead of translating every word in your head, try visualizing the object or concept directly in English.
So instead of translating the word apple, I should picture a crisp red apple in my mind.
Precisely.
Okay, that makes sense. It's like building a direct pathway in your brain between the concept and the English word. They also mentioned using flashcards, but with a bit of a twist.
Yes, using pictures instead of translations on the back of the flashcards.
Hold on. So if I'm learning the word cat, I should have a picture of a cat on the back of the flashcard instead of the translation in my native language.
You got it.
That's much more engaging than just staring at a translated word. So we've talked about thinking in English during the day, but what about when we're not actively studying? Like when we're watching a movie or listening to music?
That's where immersion comes in. The Simple Pod emphasizes surrounding yourself with English media, but with a conscious effort to engage with the language.
So instead of just zoning out during a movie, I should be trying to understand the dialogue directly in English.
Yes. Challenge yourself to think about the plot, the characters, the emotions, all in English.
But what if I don't understand every single word?
That's okay. The key is to keep your brain engaged.
So it's like turning passive entertainment into an active learning experience.
Exactly.
Okay, I see. But what about actually speaking the language? I mean, we can't just live in our heads forever, right?
Absolutely. That's where practice with a conversation partner is so crucial.
But finding a conversation partner can be a challenge.
That's true, but the Simple Pod has some great advice on that. They suggest finding a language partner, joining a conversation group, or even using online platforms.
So just dive headfirst into those conversations and embrace those mistakes as learning opportunities.
Exactly. Remember, even native English speakers make mistakes.
That's a good point. It's easy to get caught up in trying to speak perfectly. But in reality, fluency is about communicating effectively. The Simple Pod seems to emphasize patience and consistency in this whole fluency journey.
They do. It's a marathon, not a sprint.
But how do we stay motivated, especially when progress can feel slow?
That's a great question, and we'll dive into that more in part 2 of this deep dive, where we explore the science behind language acquisition and the importance of celebrating those small wins along the way.
Sounds good. We'll be right back after a quick break. It's so easy to get discouraged when you hit those roadblocks in language learning. But thinking of it as a marathon really helps put things in perspective.
It does.
You know, it's fascinating how the simple pod breaks down the science behind it all, like how thinking in English actually creates new neural pathways in our brains. Can you explain that a bit more?
Yeah, so every time you use English, you're essentially strengthening those pathways.
Right.
It's like working out a muscle. The more you use it, the stronger it gets.
So it's use it or lose it for our brains.
Exactly. And that's why the Simple Pod emphasizes that this rewiring takes time. It doesn't happen overnight.
It's like learning a new instrument or a new sport. It takes time and effort.
Exactly. And just like with any skill, you'll hit plateaus and setbacks along the way. But the key is to not give up.
I think that's so important for language learners to hear, because it's easy to get discouraged when progress isn't linear.
It's not.
Yeah.
And it's important to celebrate those small wins along the way. Maybe you finally grasped a tricky grammar rule, or you had a conversation without constantly translating in your head. Those are victories.
They are. And I think it's important to find what motivates you personally. Maybe it's watching your favorite TV show without subtitles, or finally reading that English book you've been wanting to. Just find something that makes you excited to use the language.
Absolutely. Motivation is key. Now, another point the Simple Pod brings up is active listening when you're consuming English media.
So not just passively listening, but really engaging with what you're hearing.
Exactly.
But how do you actually do that? It's easy to just get lost in the story.
It does take effort, but try to identify new words. Pay attention to how sentences are structured. You could even repeat phrases out loud to practice your pronunciation.
So it's like turning watching a movie into a language learning game.
Exactly. And you can apply this to music, podcasts, audiobooks, anything you listen to.
Okay, so it's all about being an active participant.
Yes.
This is really starting to paint a complete picture for me. It's not just about memorizing rules. It's about immersing yourself and training your brain.
It is.
Now, we've talked about thinking in English, immersing ourselves in the language, but the Simple Pod also talks about finding a conversation partner. And I think for a lot of people, myself included, that can be intimidating, making mistakes in front of someone.
It is a common fear. But remember, everyone makes mistakes. It's part of learning.
That's true. But where do you even start looking for a conversation partner?
Well, there are language exchange groups, online platforms you can use, or even just ask friends or colleagues.
Oh, that's a good idea.
Yeah, and the key is to just start talking, even if it feels awkward at first.
So dive in and embrace those mistakes.
Exactly.
It sounds like the Simple Pod really emphasizes that speaking is crucial for fluency.
It is. It forces you to think on your feet, recall vocabulary, and build sentences in real time.
It's like the ultimate test.
It is, and the more you practice, the more comfortable and confident you'll become.
Okay, I'm convinced I need to find a conversation partner and start putting this into practice. But besides improving fluency, what are some other benefits of thinking in English?
Well, it can also help you understand the culture and the nuances of the language better. It can even change how you think about the world.
Really? So it's not just about communication, it's about gaining a new perspective.
Exactly. It expands your horizons.
Wow, I hadn't thought about it that way. It makes this whole journey even more rewarding.
It does. It becomes a personal growth journey.
I love that. So thinking in English isn't just a language hack, it's a path to personal and intellectual development.
Exactly. And the Simple Pod highlights that beautifully.
Well, this deep dive has been eye-opening. I'm feeling so inspired to take my English to the next level.
I'm glad to hear that. And remember, the key is to enjoy the process.
Absolutely. And with all these techniques, I think it's definitely possible to achieve fluency while having fun along the way.
I agree.
So, ready to move on to part 3?
Let's do it. We'll uncover some even more advanced techniques for thinking in English.
Sounds good. Okay, so we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into thinking in English. We've covered so much already. But before we go, I'm curious, does the Simple Pod have any other tips or techniques for us?
They do. One thing they really highlight is embracing those moments when you feel stuck. Those times when you just can't seem to find the right word or express yourself clearly?
Oh, yeah, I know those moments all too well. It can be so frustrating.
It can be. But the Simple Pod says those moments are actually opportunities.
Opportunities?
Yeah. They say to take a step back, analyze why you're stuck. Is it vocabulary, grammar, or maybe just need to rephrase your thought?
So it's like turning those frustrating moments into mini lessons. Instead of getting discouraged, we can use them to actually learn and improve.
Exactly. It's all about having that growth mindset when learning a language.
I like that.
Another point they bring up is using English to learn other subjects.
Wait, you mean like studying math or science in English?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that make things harder?
It might seem that way, but the Simple Pod actually argues that it can help you understand both the subject and the language better.
Really?
Yeah, because you're forcing yourself to think about those complex ideas in English.
So it's like a double benefit. You're learning the subject and improving your English at the same time.
Exactly. And it can be a really engaging way to learn, especially if you're already interested in that subject.
That's true. Like if you're passionate about history, why not read a history book in English?
Exactly.
That's really interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way. I guess it's about finding creative ways to make learning English a part of our everyday lives.
It is.
Okay, so before we wrap up this deep dive completely, let's recap some of the key takeaways we got from the Simple Pod.
Okay, sounds good.
Well, we learned that thinking in English is like the foundation of fluency. It's about rewiring our brains to make English the automatic choice, not just a language we're studying.
Yeah, and we talked about different ways to do that, like describing things around us, talking to ourselves in English, and using pictures instead of translations on flashcards.
Right. And we also talked about immersing ourselves in English media, finding a conversation partner and not being afraid of making mistakes.
It's been a really great overview of this whole approach to language learning.
It has. I feel like I have a much better understanding of what it really means to be fluent in English now. It's not just about the grammar and vocab. It's about changing our mindset and making English a part of who we are.
Absolutely. And as you continue on your journey, just remember to experiment and find what works best for you.
That's a good point. Everyone learns differently.
They do.
And remember, you're not alone in this. There's tons of support out there, so keep practicing, keep exploring, and have fun with it.
Absolutely have fun.
Okay, now before we say goodbye, I have one final question for you and for all our listeners. If thinking in English can unlock fluency in a new language, could we apply the same principle to other skills we want to learn?
Ooh, that's an interesting thought.
Like, could we think like a programmer or a musician to speed up our learning in those areas?
Exactly. Could we immerse ourselves in the minds of experts and adopt their thought patterns? What would it mean to think like a chef or think like an artist?
Wow, that's a really thought-provoking question. I think I'll be pondering that one for a while. And to all our listeners out there, keep those brains buzzing and never stop learning. Until next time, happy exploring.